Welcome to another podcast of the Queer Column. Today we have with us Professor Scott Skinner-Thompson, an associate professor of law and an affiliate faculty for the LGBTQ study program at the University of Colorado. Professor Thompson has a diverse experience in multiple areas of law, notably privacy law and constitutional law, with special focus on LGBTQ rights and HIV/AIDS. Professor Thompson has been a professor at the New York University as well and has significant experience within the judiciary, both as a lawyer and a clerk under a judge. He has published two books on AIDS and privacy laws and has written numerous articles, which we are privileged to have been able to read. In today's podcast, we would be delving into Professor Thompson's research in his latest article on the theme of the latest wave of anti-trans laws that can be witnessed in the United States of America and how such laws violate the Equal Protection Clause. So, before we move forward with certain specific questions, I think it would be great if Professor Thompson could provide us with an introduction to his piece.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me with you today, Manvi and Gaurav. And yeah, the piece really focuses on the wave of anti-trans legislation that is sweeping parts of the United States. When it comes to the treatment of transgender people, the United States is really falling into a situation of two Americas, and you're seeing that in a lot of issues where you have more conservative states um, uh, enacting laws to oppress transgender people, and more progressive states enacting legislation, albeit imperfect, seeking to empower and recognize the sanctity and beauty of transgender and gender nonconforming lives. So this article focuses on these uh, anti-trans laws, and I think the first just tries to sort of get a sense of the scale of these laws, and there are many different varieties, and so the article breaks down into roughly a dozen categories, different kinds of laws that are being enacted. And a lot of these laws are being challenged, some of them successfully, but they're often challenged in isolation, and this is an instance where I think focusing on the trees, so to speak, is less illuminating than getting a broader view of the whole forest. And here, there's really 12 categories of laws that are being enacted. You have bathroom bills that seek to forbid trans people from using bathrooms consistent with their gender identity. You have the segregation of trans people in the carceral system, which is particularly problematic given over-policing of trans people and their over-representation within the carceral system. You have laws prohibiting gender-affirming care for minors. You have laws like those in Texas that literally seek to try to take trans youth from their parents when the parents are being supportive of them, in effect, kidnapping trans kids from gender affirming parents. You have restrictions on gender affirming care for adults. So, for example, if a state says, oh, you can't use state-sponsored health care for gender-affirming care, well, if you're a person who's needs and relies on gender-affirming care, an adult, for your healthcare, that amounts to a total ban because you need the state-sponsored healthcare to access care. You have laws that prohibit accurate identification documents for trans people. You have laws that literally ban schools from using accurate pronouns for trans kids in schools. You have laws that say this is your gender, that dictate what a person's gender is. And Florida, for example, says, no, it's false. This is the truth about someone's gender, as if the state of Florida knows better than an individual what their gender is. You have laws that are seeking to erase queer people from the K through 12 curriculum, literally taking us out of the history book. You have laws that force schools to out trans students to their parents, potentially endangering those students when they go home. And then, of course, you have laws that seek to ban trans female athletic participation, and laws that are seeking to ban drag shows. So this is not some isolated attack on trans people. This is not some, nuanced effort to say, well, maybe in a certain context, and again, I'm being generous here. Maybe we should think more critically about athletic participation. That's not what's happening. These legislatures are being enacting totalizing laws restricting transgender people from whole from basically broad participation in public life. And I think that is having really concrete and negative implications for these people's lives. And I think understanding the forest through the trees helps illustrate why these laws are grounded in unconstitutional animus in violation of the U.S. Constitution's equal protection clause.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Thompson. I feel like coming to law school has been sort of an awakening for at least me, because coming here made me realize what kind of struggles transgender people actively face, and the significance of being able to being referred to with your preferred choice of pronouns. Something so minute, but it has such great impacts towards one's self-esteem and how they identify themselves. So I do believe that this is an extremely important topic that we do need to discuss, and perhaps we can move forward with certain specific questions in order to structure our discussion for today's podcast. And the first question that intrigued me while reading your work was that, have you been able to trace or derive certain common patterns or common themes that emerge from these anti-trans legislations that have been passed within certain states in the United States? And if so, then what are these patterns?
Yeah, well, and so, I think yes. I mean, I think that there are patterns, right? Not every um, sort of state is necessarily doing all 12 of these laws, but many of them are doing a lot of them. And so you see that sort of trans identity has really become this a driving force behind the conservative agenda in America. And as I mentioned, each of these laws seems sort of narrow, but when you put them together, over 12 different kinds of laws, it's really trying to push trans people, erase them from public space. And many times the laws uh, mimic each other. It's not as if like these legislators are necessarily being terribly creative. They're copying each other. Oftentimes, they're getting draft legislation from conservative groups that are basically going out, conservative advocacy groups, going out to legislators in different states and saying, "Here, introduce this bill, um, pass this bill." And so, yeah, you're seeing a lot of commonality. Youth is at the forefront of a lot of these laws. They've tried to create a narrative that somehow recognizing trans youth identity and allowing them options when it comes to the healthcare is somehow um, mutilating these youth. Um, when it's really just giving them choices, right? Nobody's being forced to do these things. And the hypocrisy here when it comes to these issues is really put into very sharp and clear relief when you look at the conservatives' approach to the regulation of people that are born with intersex conditions. You know, in a lot of these laws, when it comes to youth, the right will say, well, no, you can't allow youth to go to a doctor and, after informed consent, have medical interventions, right? And it's just giving them a choice. Nobody's being forced to do anything. Conversely, the laws that are being passed specifically say, oh, this doesn't apply to, the surgeries that are performed on infants, okay? Shortly after they're born, to confirm and make them align with the purported gender or sex binary, right? These groups are saying, yeah, it's totally fine to have surgical interventions on infants to make them align with the gender binary, but if we're giving adolescents choice with regard to medical interventions, and surgery, even in this context, is quite rare. I mean, a lot of times we're talking about um, hormonal interventions. Um, they say that's problematic. But so any medical intervention to empower trans youth to um, not conform with the binary, problematic. Surgery on infants to make them conform, totally um, fine. And as I try to trace in the article, you go down any of these 12 categories, and the hypocrisy, the double standards um, that are evidenced by these laws is very plain. And indeed, there have been examples where legislators say, even in the adolescent context, it, saying yes, it would be totally fine under this law for a adolescent male who is assigned male at birth, but who has developed, uh, significant breast tissue, which happens, okay, to have a breast reduction, because that would be helping them to conform with stereotypes about masculinity. But if a person who was assigned female at birth, wanted to have the same surgery, okay, they could not, right? And so really underscoring that their concern is not the medical interventions themselves, it's whether the intervention is propping up the binary or not.
So, Professor, regarding the 12 laws you said, how do you believe these shape the national discourse and public perception around transgender issues? Do they contribute to polarization and politicization of LGBTQ rights? And how is America addressing these concerns?
Um, so great, great question. I think that the laws are having a terrible impact on trans people across the country. Not only when they're enacted, but the trans existence, trans people have been turned into a political football, right? Like they're being kicked around in the public discourse, and their identities are being weaponized for political purposes um, by the right. And make no mistake, you know, yes, the laws have an impact, but to the point of your question, I think the rhetoric too, and to the point that Manvi made at the outset, right? Just the discussion and the discourse harms trans people, and we really need to combat it and start recognizing even more so the sanctity of transgender people and their experiences. And to the last point of your question, absolutely. I mean, the article in my research is this article at least is really focused on all these bad laws, but of course, there are many people valiantly fighting for trans lives that recognize um, their beautifulness, and I think it's really important every opportunity we get to reaffirm the value of trans people and their incredible uh, lives, and that they should be celebrated rather than denigrated.
That was extremely insightful, Professor Thompson. Since we just discussed how national discourse on rights for transgender people often leads to politicization of LGBTQ rights, in furtherance of that idea, my next question is that how, in your opinion, do these laws affect the right of transgender individuals to access basic necessities such as healthcare, education, employment of opportunities. And I think a lot of it ties back to what you discussed in your introduction regarding how transgender people aren't allowed to access public spaces like bathrooms or are restricted based on their gender. So maybe we can elaborate further on that idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And make no mistake, I mean, these laws all have a compounding effect, which is, if you can't get access to accurate identification, or are not getting an adequate education because you are scared to go to school, right? That leaves legacies on transgender lives, and it is going to mean that you're subject to material deprivation over the course of your life, right? Like not being able to get a job, not being able to get housing, not getting to get healthcare. You're going to be stuck in a cycle of of oppression, and that may lead you, for example, to commit crimes of necessity that ensnare you in the criminal justice system. So all of these things work together and compound each other to create oppression for trans people. One context where I think this is significant, and then my sort of more recent work is, and what I'm starting to research is how this also means that trans people are being literally pushed out of the political process. So they're being disenfranchised from the polls. So not even able to, participate in the democracy to try to change these policies that are affecting them. So if you can't get an accurate identification document, if you live in a state that requires an ID to vote, right, you will have barriers to voting, meaning you can't even vote to change these laws, right? If you've been ensnared in the carceral system because the over-policing of gender identity, or you've engaged in crimes of survival, because of you're impoverished, you may not be able to vote because of laws that forbid convicted felons from voting, right? And so then you have transgender people who can't even, participate in the democratic process to change, to try to change the ways in which they're being treated. And this is particularly significant when, literally right now, trans people are on the ballot. Legislators are passing a lot of these laws, but conservatives are also trying to get issues pertaining to the regulation of transgender lives on the ballots for direct democracy, right? Not just who you elect, but trying to get ballot initiatives that say, oh, trans people shouldn't be able to play sports. Okay, so they're trying to use to help them with overall voter turnout. Meanwhile, trans lives are literally on the ballot, and many trans people can't vote because of the systems of disenfranchisement that I just outlined.
So you mentioned how the legislature is currently very anti-trans, and how do you think what role does faith-based organizations and religious beliefs and moral arguments play in the push for these laws? Like, can these perspectives be reconciled with principles of inclusivity and non-discrimination?
Well, I think reconciling whether something is reconcilable with anybody's own individual spiritual belief is up to that. In my view, is up to that. Is that up to that in individuals? Certainly, I think that there are faith traditions, including many within certain progressive Christian traditions in the United States, that which is the predominant religion, that do recognize the sanctity and beauty of transgender identities. Unfortunately, many organizations in the United States, conservative Christian organizations, have made what they view as moral and essential arguments about the existence of transgender identity say that they basically don't exist. And yes, a lot of the movement here is driven by Christian conservative groups, and that, in my view, is deeply unfortunate. But again, I think it's important to recognize that there are many faith groups that do recognize the sanctity of trans lives. I also think it's important to recognize that, you know, when these arguments, these religious arguments, are made against trans lives, like these same arguments were made against same-sex marriage and are still raised against same-sex marriage and gay people. They were also raised against, you know, racial integration, right? You know, they're going back to the 1960s when the U.S. government sought to fight segregation of the races. Business owners would say, "Oh, it violates my religious right to make me, you know, treat black and white people and people of other racial groups the same," right? And the Supreme Court rejected those arguments. And then, you know, similar arguments are being made now, and the Supreme Court's having more acceptance of them, saying, "Oh, making me serve people who want to get in a gay wedding amendment uh, uh, right." So, you know, these arguments about religious freedom are not new. They've often been used to try to justify discrimination against minoritized groups. How that's going to play out with respect to trans people, I don't know. I can't say with this current Supreme Court. I'm terribly optimistic.
Thank you for that enlightening explanation, Professor Thompson. Taking into consideration that such laws do not simply impact the legal rights of transgender people, but it also adversely affects their psychological frame of mind. My question to you is, according to you, how is this how do these laws take a psychological and emotional toll on these transgender individuals, particularly within the youth? And how do they impact their mental health, self-esteem, and overall well-being?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so critical. I mean, the messaging around this is of acute importance, and you know, we have laws and leaders that are going out there engaging in um, really repulsive rhetoric. I mean, in the article, uh, you know, I talk about the legislation. I also, with the help of my incredible research assistants, look at what some of the legislators are saying, and the things they are saying are, in many instances, hateful. And you know, I'm not trans. I'm a queer gay man. Um, I remember, you know, when I was a kid in the closet, like of course, these you know, speaking from my own personal experience, hearing people espouse anti-queer messages has a effect. It reinforces the closet, right? It denigrates your self-esteem, and this is happening even in context of like youth sports, right? The arguments are, oh, cis girls need to be able to win. Okay, I think everybody should have an opportunity. I think winning is not a birthright, okay? And the key goal of youth sports is not creating winners, it's creating self-esteem, sense of community, camaraderie, healthy lifestyles among youth. And we're saying, no, you can't be involved in that. Like, you can't be a part of this community. And I think that's really, really deeply unfortunate. And that, you know, victory for certain, you know, students is being prioritized over the overall health of the student population. And so, again, getting back to the earlier conversation, I think it's really important that we do everything we can rhetorically and materially to reinforce the incredible beauty of the transgender lives.
So taking things from an international perspective, how is the international community viewing the rise of anti-trans legislation in the US? And do you think there are any parallels in other countries?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Gaurav. So I'd be interested in your perspectives on this as well. But I will say that yes, there are other countries that are engaged in similar debates. The UK is one example of that. Um, I don't have a sense, globally how it's being perceived, but I will say that this kind of legislation significantly erodes the US's moral high ground when it tries to promote LGBTQ rights abroad. And so, for example, there are countries like Uganda who have enacted very draconian anti-homosexual laws, right? The Anti-Homosexual Act in Uganda, and we have the U.S. State Department saying, "Oh, that's really bad," right? Um, we're sort of speaking from throwing rocks from a glass house, and these kind of laws undermine our credibility and undermine our ability to fight for LGBTQ rights abroad, because these countries are able to say, "Oh, look what a bunch of your states are doing," um, uh, and also like it's the same religious groups that are going to these countries and promoting these laws, right? It's Christian U.S. Christian conservatives that are going to Uganda and fomenting this hate. And there's been important litigation challenging that by the sexual minorities Uganda versus Scott Lively. They've tried to sue some American pastor who went over there to foment some of these hates. So I think it really undermines our credibility. And I think it contributes to a lack of moral clarity on these issues. But I'd be very interested to hear, what impact you think this is having in India, as the fight for LGBTQ rights in India is also obviously an evolving one.
I feel given the like I think India has been in talks given the recent judgment regarding same-sex marriage, and I feel like the major problem stems from the fact that the legislature is very hesitant in the judiciary is very hesitant in stepping into or interfering with the acts of the legislature, and that I believe is like one of the core problems that we're facing at the moment. Because even within the same-sex marriage judgment, uh, while the while some of the while some of the judges in the bench were cognizant of the fact that there is a right to marry that is very intrinsic within fundamental rights within the Constitution of India. However, they weren't willing to forego and step interfere with the legislative proceedings. So I feel that acts as a deterrent within India at least.
So there's also this point about how there's a disconnect between judiciary and the legislature. So the judiciary order, so during the Trans Recognition Act, they should have the right for self-recognition, which is not guaranteed by the legislature, where you have to necessarily undergo a medical procedure if you want to be a trans person in the country.
Yeah, I feel like
Fascinating.
there are a lot of common themes. Like some of the things that you mentioned in context of the United States of America, a lot of it is reflected within India as well, especially as Gaurav mentioned with regards to sex redetermination surgeries. So all of that is something that we see within India as well. So that is some sort of a common context for us. I feel like
Fascinating.
uh,
Well, thank you so much for
right. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Thompson. That would be all from our side. I would like to extend our sincere gratitude to you for agreeing to participate in this podcast. We had a fruitful discussion, and I believe our audience will also find it extremely interesting. So, thank you so much for joining us today. Do you have any concluding comments?
just my sincere thanks to you both for drawing attention to these issues and for inviting me. And I hope we have a chance at some point to meet in person. But thank you again, and good luck with your studies.
Thank you so much. We wish to meet you in the near future as well, hopefully.
Take care.
Thank you, Professor. Good evening.